Hello, and welcome to Improbable Things. I'm J. Grace Pennington, and this is my podcast where I share 6 improbable thoughts before breakfast, which is 6 thoughts about reading, writing, or just storytelling in general. And I had a little bit of trouble coming up with my 6 things for today, so this might be a short episode, but I've got them now, so let's get started. So number 1, I wanted to share that I officially have started on revisions for my book Firmament Gestern, which is book 5 in the series. So this will be the second to last probably big revision I'm going to do, because the 2 most recent books, I feel like I'm just gonna go over real quick to fix a couple of consistency issues, because these are the ones that are about to be published or were just published late last year, so I'm not gonna go over them in a major way since I just got them out, so I've really just been over them. So there's this book 5 and then book 6, which I'm doing both this month, hopefully, are kind of the last 2 that I think will be a really big project. So I'm really just proud of myself for staying on track with this and finally pushing through it. It's just been such a huge project and one that I've put off for so long. But anyway, yes, I feel like it's definitely going well on this one. This one was published, I don't know, maybe like 4 years ago. And most of the things, there are a lot of instances in this one, since I'm changing some characters' ages, where I'm having to go in and tweak those things, because this book deals a lot with their pasts, the particular characters whose ages are being changed. So probably the most instances that I'll have to fix of that are in this book. But other than that, there's not too many things. There's just some extraneous words, or a couple, a few awkward sentences, or just a few things. So I think it's going well. So glad to be getting started on that one and to be well over halfway through this massive project. And number 2, one thing that I decided to do as I'm doing these revisions, a huge motivation for me to do it was to update and add to and change some of the front and back matter, so the stuff that's before and after the story, because I wanted to do some things like, I needed to update my blurb, because just about the one about myself, my author, just a little about me section, because I've changed a lot in the last 10 years since I started the series. But then also I wanted to do things like add a list of the other books in the series, and one thing I wanted to do was put some kind of teaser for the next book to kind of get people continuing in the series. And so what I put, as I first have gone through the books, is just the blurb for the next book, like the synopsis. So I'll just say, like, to be continued. If you enjoyed this book, you can find book whatever, next installment on Amazon, and then here's like just a little description of that book. But when my formatter got it back to me and we were discussing that part a little bit, she suggested that I might consider putting instead of putting the blurb, I might consider putting a little sample actually of the next book, like a sample scene, because that's pretty common in the series. It's what she does with her series, and so I wasn't sure about that, and I took a little poll in one of my Facebook writing groups, and the response has overwhelmingly been in favor of a sample scene instead of the description of the next book. So I think I'm gonna do that, but what I'm torn about is, I feel like I don't know if I should put just the first part of the next book, or if I should like seek out a real exciting, like cliffhangery kind of scene to put there. So I'm just trying to decide about that. I originally was thinking, because I think if I put the first part, I kind of have to put the whole first chapter, which does add a lot of pages to the book. But that seems to be kind of the standard thing to do. And then also, it really does, I think, I think it could be helpful to pull people into the next book because you're kind of reading along. Oh, you're reading this chapter of the book, and then it ends. If you want to read more, got to get the next book. So I think it might help just like keep some momentum going for readers in the series. So hopefully, so that's my new project. If I want to get these books up, is I've got to put some scenes in there, and just once I do that, I think I'll be ready to get the first couple of books out, the new editions. So that's going to be super exciting. Number 3, one thing I've been thinking a lot about as I do these revisions also is that I'm going to need to update the audiobook for the first book, because the first book, Ray the Alloy, has an audiobook out, and I just narrated it myself. And that's something I've wanted to do for the whole series for a long time, but I haven't gotten around to it. And I mean, in a way, I wish I would have done it before now, which for reasons I'll explain in a second. But then if I'd done it before now, they'd be the old editions anyway. So I guess it's just as well. But my problem is that I cannot figure out a good place in our house to do revisions, because I have to do it basically early in the morning, like with this podcast, because that's when everyone's asleep and when the house is quiet. However, the house is never really quiet enough because we live right off of a very main road. And so there's just always a lot of sounds, cars going by and things like that. And there's not really like our house is kind of long and thin is the best way I know how to describe it. There's not like a place really away from the road. Or like we realized recently, because we were trying to figure out what in the midst of a tornado warning where in the house we would go, and we're like, there's not one room in this house without windows. Like it's all facing the outside. So I'm trying to figure out what I do, like when I'm in the morning when I'm doing this podcast, I am in the room that's kind of farthest from the house, and also of course it has no people sleeping in it, and so that's another consideration. And so I'm trying to figure out, like, maybe I can create some kind of little makeshift, I don't know, something to dampen some sound. I don't know, I just have to figure it out, because I think it would be really beneficial to the series to do some audiobooks, and it would be a big project, but since I would just be my own producer, I could take however long I wanted. So that would be, I could even just do a little tiny bit at a time. So we'll see. I've got to figure that one out and just see how I can find a place in this poor house to get some good sound quality. Number 4, I probably have mentioned at some point that we around here love Dr. Seuss books. They're some of our favorites. We own most of the famous ones, or the more popular ones. And we get others from the library. My girls have audiobooks of them. Like, we're just big fans. We were reading some just yesterday. But the other day, we were talking while I was making lunch, and I came up with this idea. I told the girls, I'm going to say a line from a Dr. Seuss book, and y'all tell me what the story is that it's from, because I've read them enough in my life that I have some of them pretty much memorized. And I wasn't sure how they would take to it, but it was so much fun, and they did a great job. Like, I would be like, okay, here we go. The sun did not shine. It was too wet to play. So we sat in the house all that cold, cold, wet day. And they're like, it's from The Cat in the Hat. And we did a whole bunch. We did from Horton Hears a Who, and The Grinch, and Green Eggs and Ham, and all of our favorites. And I just picked different lines from the different stories, and they were able to guess most of them. And it was such a fun game. So I need to think of some similar things that we can do, because it was, interactive and enjoyable, and it was just a fun little game. So if you're looking for something to do with little kids who love Dr. Seuss, I can recommend that. And number 5, currently reading, it is, as I predicted, still David Copperfield. but this has to be the last week because it's due back at the library in a couple of days. So we'll see how that goes. I'm making really good progress on it, so I think I'll be able to make it. And I don't even have that much new to say about it. It's just really good. One thing that I've found interesting, because I think I mentioned, even though I've read it before, I forgot probably like 95% of it. Like I just didn't remember much of what it was even about. And it's just been, so it's been really enjoyable to revisit because it's almost like reading it for the first time. And I feel like it's interesting because it's one of those stories, like a lot of things definitely happen to the main character, David Copperfield, but really it's more his observations and experiences with all these characters around him. And there's such a variety of different characters and storylines that go on with the different people in his life and just some really crazy characters. And so many, just such contrasting things just among all the surrounding characters. And I just think that's super interesting because I feel like a lot of times those stories that are more, there's a lot of stories that are mainly about the effect that the main character has on those around them. And I enjoy those stories a lot, but this is not really even that. I mean, he obviously does have an impact on the people around him, but it really is not, it really is more just their stories than it is his influence on their stories. And it's more his observations. And as he's a writer, so I think that's part of it too, because that's a big part of being a writer, is just observing things that go on around you and comparing, contrasting, having thoughts and observations about all of it. And that's kind of what the book is, which may be partly why I love it so much, because as a writer, I remembered that I found David Copperfield as a narrator to be a very relatable character. And so that may be one reason why, because I sort of tend to think the same way, just making all these observations and filing away life truths about the things going on around me. And so anyway, it's interesting because I feel like, normally if you're describing a book to someone, it would, you'd be telling what happens to the main character, what they do, how they save the world or the people around them or something. And this really is more just like all these things that are surrounding him in his life more than anything about him specifically. So, but it's just so well done, because I do think that's hard to pull off. Like, I don't know if I could do it in a way that makes the main character still so compelling and makes the story, just pulls you forward so well. So as always, Dickens is just a genius. And this, I think, is maintaining its place as one of my favorite of his books for sure, and one of my favorite books of all time. So number 6, this was just a thought that I had at some point while scrolling through Twitter, because apparently this is Indie April, which I didn't even know about. So I guess I need to be taking advantage of that, using some of these resources that are out there right now for marketing indie books. But it got me thinking about the whole idea of self-publishing and indie publishing, because that's something I always knew that I wanted, like from when I was a kid and thinking about writing. As soon as I was introduced to the idea of self-publishing, which back then was a very different proposition because there weren't really things like Amazon that would do print-on-demand publishing. So it was a lot more expensive, like you have to go get your books printed and stuff like that. But even at that time, I knew that it was what I wanted. And for the most part, I've never really swayed from that or, had any doubts about it, even though it's a lot of work and I haven't been like hugely successful with it. But I still felt like it was the right path. And then just kind of recently, just in the past year, as I've been taking writing more seriously, and also as I have such limited time at this, period in my life, I've started thinking, like, wondering, is this the right path? Should I consider traditional publishing, maybe for some of the other books that I'm working on or thinking about? Just kind of processing that. I even did a couple webinars about querying traditional publishers and things like that, and just kind of considering. But then it was interesting because I think I mentioned I went to this local Christian writers group last month, and there were so many talented writers there, and there were a few of them that had been traditionally published and are now in the process of changing over to indie publishing because they had just had such bad experiences with traditional publishing. And they're not the only ones either. I've talked with multiple people that originally had their works traditionally published and it just was not good. And it's for the same reasons that I chose indie publishing in the first place, because you just have no control over what is done with your work when you go the traditional publishing route. And honestly, even the things that are appealing about it, like the idea that, I think the idea is that they would do a lot of the marketing for you, but that really isn't even the case unless you're a really big popular author already. For the most part, you still have to do a lot of it, and you lose so many rights. Like you lose the right to decide on editing decisions, on the cover, or things that I'm working on now with my revisions, like what I'm going to do with the back matter in the book. Like you would not have much or any say over that in the traditional publishing world. And then just things like, I've heard multiple stories where then maybe the publisher stops even putting your book out, and yet you will not give you back the rights, or you can't get the rights back, so you can't even have your own book even if they're not using it. And it just sounds like an absolute nightmare to me. And so I know that it is possible to be successful in that, in that way, and I know that there's people that it's still the best path for them, but it just has been reinforcing to me so much lately that this is what I want, because that's the reason I always wanted it, is just the control. Like, this is my story that has come from my heart and that I've worked so much on. I do not want to give up my control over it and my right to make it continue to be the story that I want it to be. And it's just, for me, I love control anyway, so that's a whole other problem. But it's just, I do think